paradrama tales.
I thought. Losing Mom was the hardest thing I'd ever face until Dad announced he'd moved on just 9 months later, knocking someone up 5 months after her funeral. I wasn't ready for a new life under our roof, and suddenly home felt like a betrayal. 14 months have passed since Mom's laughter faded from this house, and every corner still echoes with her absence. Back then, Dad told me that grief was a journey measured in years, not months, that honoring someone's memory required patience, respect, and, most of all, time. He'd point to family friends who remarried too soon after a spouse died, and speak of them with quiet disdain, saying it felt like erasing the past instead of holding it sacred. So, I lived by his unspoken rule: no talk of boys, no TV shows that reminded me of her, no plans for birthdays or holidays, until 2 years had quietly landed behind us. I memorized every platitude about stages of grief from books and articles: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and tried to fit my own pain into neat boxes. But real loss refused to be categorized. Some mornings, I woke up expecting to see her slippers at the foot of my bed. Other days, I could barely crawl out of mine under the weight of sadness. My teachers noticed I blinked back tears when anyone spoke of moving on, and my friends tiptoed around me as though my sorrow had become a contagious secret. At family gatherings, I sat quietly, while cousins exchanged stories of new romances, my silence more telling than any complaint. I kept journals filled with lists of memories: the way she made pancakes shaped like flowers, the hush of her voice when bedtime prayers turned hopeful. And although writing helped, it also reminded me how those moments would never return. Meanwhile, Dad sank into his routine of work, small talk, and polite avoidance. He'd glance at me over his coffee each morning, his eyes a mix of love and fear, wondering if he'd said the wrong thing or laughed at the wrong time. In those moments, I saw the man I admired wrestle with his own grief in private, never sure how much to share with a child whose world had just shattered. I felt torn between wanting his comfort and craving the solitude to grieve on my own terms. After all, no one gave me a manual for mourning a mother and navigating the fractured relationship that followed. I mourned not only her, but the father-daughter bond we once shared. Friday night dinners whispered secrets, his proud smile at my school plays. Without Mom, our family's blueprint felt lost, and I clung to the idea that there must be a right way to feel a timeline stamped by society's good graces. But grief, I learned, isn't polite or punctual. It crashes through your life with no warning, reshaping your heart in ways no rulebook can predict. And so I continued day by day trying to honor her memory, while dreading the moment when the calendar would tick past my father's invisible deadline, because what would it mean if we were ready to move on before that invisible clock struck 2 years? That evening began like any other. I sat at the kitchen table tracing the grain of the wood with restless fingers, while Dad fumbled with words he'd clearly been rehearsing in his mind all day. His face was a curious mix of nervous excitement and guilt, as though he felt both proud of this news and ashamed for how quickly it had arrived. "I have someone I want you to meet," he said at last, exhaling like he was diving into cold water. Before I could lift my head, a woman stepped into view, her smile hopeful, and her hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. She introduced herself as Lisa, Dad's girlfriend, and then dropped the bomb she was 7 months pregnant. The floor seemed to ripple beneath me, and for a moment all I could think was 9 months after Mom died, 5 months after her funeral. This was Dad's idea of timing. He launched into an explanation about how grief is unpredictable, how sometimes your heart finds new bearings before you even realize it's navigating again. But his words sounded hollow in my ears. All I could feel was a churn of disbelief and betrayal. I remembered every sermon he'd preached about respect for the dead, every pointed anecdote about spouses who moved on too soon, and now, here he was, standing beside someone who'd moved in before a single anniversary had passed. Lisa tried to reach out, gesturing toward me with a timid apology in her smile, but I recoiled. Her presence felt like a trespass, as though she'd stepped into the sacred space where only my mother's memory belonged. Dad's eyes flickered with hurt, but he continued, his voice shaking slightly, asking me to celebrate this new life, to open my heart as he'd struggled to open his. My response was bitter. I told him I supposed this was proof he never truly loved Mom, that his quick leap into another relationship revealed the hypocrisy of all his 2-year rules. Lisa's face flashed anger. She accused me of selfishness, of stealing joy from an unborn child, who didn't deserve to inherit our family drama. I watched Dad's shoulders slump as he attempted to soothe her and apologize to me at the same time, but his misplaced words sounded like another betrayal. In that charged moment, I realized that this announcement, this milestone, meant for Joy had become the sharpest possible twist of the knife slicing through everything I believed about love, loyalty, and the unspoken contract between a father and a grieving daughter. And as I walked out into the night, suitcase in hand, I understood that joy and betrayal were two sides of the same coin in our fractured family, and whichever way it landed, nothing would ever feel the same again. There was a rule in our house that Dad set in stone. Love knew its own schedule, measured not by calendar dates, but by respect for the past, at least 2 full years before daring to think of someone else. I'd heard him preach that sermon at every funeral reception, leaning in over coffee to quietly warn anyone who'd lost a spouse that moving on too soon was a slap in the face of memory. He'd recount stories of neighbors who remarried in a matter of months and shake his head, calling it disrespectful to both the dead and the children left behind. I believed him because he was my father, and because I'd watched him comfort me through sobbing night prayers, telling me that grief needed time, like a seed needs winter before it could bloom again. And then just 5 months after Mom's funeral, there he was standing beside Lisa, his new love, her belly already rounded with life. His 2-year rule felt like a cruel joke echoing in my head as he explained that grief for him simply didn't follow the manual. His words clattered hollowly against the memory of his own lectures. How could the man who insisted on a respectful timeline for moving forward be the same man who broke that timeline himself? In that moment, I understood hypocrisy wasn't just a word in a dictionary. It was a living thing that stood between us, thicker than any wall. I remembered the Sunday our town's pastor offered a blessing for widowers who found new companionship, and Dad gently patted my hand, saying no one should judge a fresh start. Yet here he was, judging others while quietly scripting his own. I thought of the afternoons he scolded me for rushing through my own grief, saying patience was a sign of true love, and how I had dutifully waited, suppressing anger and tears until the 2-year mark loomed like a promise. But when the calendar's hands barely reached 9 months, he seemed to abandon his promise to Mom, to me, to the very principle he'd taught me. My outrage blazed hotter than any candlelit sermon on forgiveness. I felt betrayed not only by his new relationship, but by the moral compass he'd handed me. How could I respect rules he discarded? How could I trust guidance that bent to his own needs? And beneath my anger lay a quieter ache, a longing for the old certainty of our bond, when Dad's word was law, and his hugs were enough to quiet any fear. Now, every time he spoke of gratitude for this unexpected joy, I sensed the distance he'd created, a gulf yawning between principle and practice that no apology could bridge. In unveiling his hypocrisy, he revealed something more painful than any betrayal, that sometimes the people we love most can't live up to the rules they teach us to follow. The day Lisa moved in was supposed to be a celebration, her first night under our roof, a welcome into a new chapter, but it felt like a battlefield. I arrived hesitantly, arms crossed over the shoulder of my grandmother's hand-me-down suitcase, and found Dad beaming as he unlocked the front door. Lisa stood in the hallway, her swollen belly like a living announcement, cheeks flushed with excitement. She reached for me with a forced smile, but I stepped back, the air between us crackling. She told me to call her Mom-to-be. Her voice sugary, but all I heard was accusation. "You're so cold." Dad tried to bridge the gap, urging me to come in to sit at the table he'd set, with Mom's fine china and the same candles she loved, an ironic echo of the past. I refused, my jaw clenched, and reminded him of his 2-year rule of the sermons he'd preached about honoring memory, and Lisa's face went rigid. She snapped, voice trembling with anger and hurt. "How dare you judge me when I'm bringing new life into this house? Do you think you own grief?" Her words rang through the silent room like a gavel. I met her glare, saying that it wasn't her. I resented, but the betrayal, the way she stepped in before a single anniversary had passed, as though Mom's absence were an invitation rather than a wound. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw genuine apology flash in her eyes, but it hardened into contempt. She accused me of selfishness, of stealing joy from her baby, with my bitterness. Dad's shoulders sagged. He placed a tentative hand on her back as though to console her, but she shrugged him off, turning her fury on me again. "You need to celebrate my baby. You need to celebrate me, or get out." The final words hung in the air like a challenge. My heart pounded not from fear, but from resolve. I looked Dad in the eye and whispered, "If family means sidelining my grief, then I'm not staying." Without another word, I picked up my suitcase and walked out the door, clicking shut behind me like a verdict. In the car, I inhaled deep and let tears come, tears for the life I'd lost. For the bond I'd hoped to salvage for the home I'd once believed was safe. That night, Lisa's fury and Dad's torn heart collided with mine, and all three of us learned the same truth. You can't force two worlds to share a space if one refuses to honor the past. I moved into Grandma's house with little more than a suitcase, and the echo of slammed doors still ringing in my ears. And for the first night in months, I slept without waking at every creak of the floorboards. Grandma greeted me at the door with a gentle hug, her perfume mingling with the soft, floral wallpaper of her guest room, and I realized how I'd forgotten what peace felt like. Days blurred into a routine of pancakes on the porch, before school afternoons spent curled up on her faded quilt, reading novels I'd abandoned when life got too loud and quiet, evenings beside her in the kitchen where she stirred soup with deliberate care and listened as I retold the story of Dad's announcement and Lisa's fury. But exile isn't freedom in Grandma's house. I was both a guest and a soldier, armed with my grief and wary of the world beyond her hedge. Every Wednesday at 6, Dad would pull into her driveway, his car idling as he gathered courage, and we'd step into her dining room, where a vase of daisies sat between us like a truce flag. He'd offer small talk questions about my classes, updates on the baby's growth, but we both knew I was testing him. Could he still be the man who celebrated my triumphs if he'd so quickly abandoned Mom's memory? And when Lisa joined us, her gloved hand resting on her belly, as she tried to smile through strained pleasantries, the air would thicken with unsaid accusations. Grandma would discreetly pass me a second helping of mashed potatoes, her eyes asking if I was managing, while I forced polite conversation that felt like walking a tightrope. I sensed her unease, too. She remembered Dad as the man who once took me fishing on lazy Saturday mornings, not the father who sent his daughter away to protect his new life. In those dinners, I realized that picking sides wasn't as simple as loyalty to blood. It meant choosing which version of my father I wanted to honor, the one who taught me how to tie my shoes, or the one who insisted on rules he discarded when he needed them. Outside Grandma's kitchen window, the world went on. Neighbors waved as Dad's Ford pulled away, and the late summer sun drifted behind oaks that had weathered more storms than I could count. At night, I'd lie awake listening for my phone to buzz with Dad's apology text or Lisa's angry voicemail, knowing that no matter how long I stayed under Grandma's roof, I still carried the key to the house I fled, and with it, the power to decide whether I'd ever return. In exile, I found clarity. Picking sides meant choosing myself first, but leaving the door ajar in case he proved worthy of coming back through. One Tuesday night, I was curled up under a quilt at Grandma's house when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number lighting up the screen. The message was short and urgent. "Help me now. I'm locked out bleeding and need my key." My first instinct was shock. Pregnant women shouldn't be left to suffer alone, but the sender wasn't my father. It was Lisa, Dad's girlfriend, borrowing his phone because she'd lost her own. My heart pounded as I stared at the words. I remembered her fury, the way she'd blame me for daring to grieve the hiss of her voice when she called me disgusting for not embracing her baby. I took a deep breath and replied with 4 stark letters, "Fuck off." No apologies, no softening. I hit send and blocked her number before I could rethink it. As I set the phone down, a strange calm washed over me. This was my boundary drawn in digital ink. That night, I slept without flinching at imagined knocks on the door. The next morning, Dad called with an apology so thick with guilt, I could taste it through the line. Lisa had waited in her car until he came home, panicked and in pain. He promised it would never happen again, that he'd ensure she respected my space. But when late-night voicemails arrived on his phone, harsh words, insults, accusations of me being a POS who didn't deserve a family, I realized apologies weren't enough if the behavior continued. During our scheduled dinner at Grandma's, Dad sat across from me, his eyes tired as I handed him his phone. He listened as Lisa's voicemail blared in the quiet kitchen. "You left me to bleed while you hid," she snarled. I crossed my arms and met Dad's gaze. "This is why I can't live there. Not until she learns respect." His silence spoke volumes, and I understood he was torn between comforting his unstable partner and honoring the daughter who'd always been his first priority. That evening, I journaled by lamplight, naming the emotions that buzzed in my chest: anger, relief, defiance, and underlining the word respect until the page blurred. I realized that crisis texts and midnight tirades were more than just drama. They were tests of my resolve, invitations to shrink or stand tall. And I chose to stand tall even if it meant living apart, even if it meant Dad's home would remain off limits until he proved he could protect my peace. In crossing those boundaries, I wasn't punishing him or Lisa. I was reclaiming my right to safety and love on my own terms. Dad's invitation came on a Thursday afternoon, wrapped in the gentlest apology I'd heard in months. "I've made mistakes, and I miss you. Please come home for dinner this Sunday, just you and me." His voice trembled when he left that message on my voicemail, as though he were offering a lifeline and not sure I'd grasp it. I stared at my phone thumb, hovering over the red delete button. I wanted to believe him. I wanted our old Sunday suppers, Mom's chicken soup, Dad's cornbread, my head perched on his shoulder as he told me about his day. But each invitation was shadowed by the memory of Lisa's glare when I accepted her arms crossed over her belly as she whispered that I belonged in Grandma's house, not his. That evening, Dad sent a text. I promised no drama, just us. He listed the menu: roast beef, mashed potatoes, your favorite peach cobbler, and signed it with "Love, Dad." I remembered how his texts used to make me smile when I was 12 and nervous about algebra, how the little heart emoji he always added felt like a secret handshake. But now that same gesture felt like a taunt. Could love really bridge the gulf between us when one side refused to honor the past? When Sunday came, I packed my overnight bag with trembling resolve. Grandma drove me to our old front door, and I rang the bell with my heart in my throat. Dad opened it, his shoulders slumping with relief when he saw me. He swept me into a hug that smelled of his cologne and old library books, and for a moment, I closed my eyes and let myself believe we could reset. Inside the table was laid exactly as he'd promised. No fine china, no candles, just our mismatched plates and the soft glow of a single lamp. But before we could sit, Lisa appeared at the doorway, her eyes narrowing when she saw me. Her voice low: "I thought you'd celebrate our family tonight." Dad's apology came out before I could speak. I asked her not to come. "This is for us." I watched her retreat, her footsteps echoing down the hallway, and felt a stab of guilt, not for leaving Grandma, but for dragging Dad into the crossfire. He pulled out my chair and gestured to the plate of meat and potatoes, his eyes warm with hope. We ate in silence at first, the only sound the scrape of silverware. Then he spoke, voice soft. "I understand if you hate me, but I love you more than anything. Help me fix this, please." I looked at him, really looked, and saw the man who taught me to ride a bike, who stayed up late when I was sick, who held me when I cried over lost friendships. I felt the old bond flicker, but I also felt the ache of betrayal, the raw edges of my grief still unhealed. And so, I whispered my ultimatum: "I'll come back, but not until I know you'll choose me first, every time. No more apologies, just proof." He nodded, tears glistening, and reached across the table to cover my hand. In that moment, love felt like both a promise and a test. Could it truly bridge the divide, or was it simply a fragile thread waiting to snap? I didn't answer. Instead, I let his hand hold mine, and I waited to see if he'd tighten his grip or let go. In the weeks that followed Dad's plea, I found myself standing at a crossroads between the familiar pull of guilt and the uncharted territory of self-respect. And I realized that reclaiming my voice meant choosing myself over shame. I began by speaking aloud the truths I had whispered in the dark, that my grief was valid, my anger righteous, and my right to protection non-negotiable. At Grandma's kitchen table, I told her I would not apologize for needing space, and for the first time, I saw relief wash across her face as though permission had been granted at long last. I wrote letters to Dad, unsent raw pages where I named every bruise his quick rebound had left on my heart. And then I crumpled them in the trash with a sense of triumph, because the act of writing had freed my tongue from silence. In group therapy, I stood when they asked for volunteers and voice trembling, then steady shared my story of betrayal and boundary setting. Watching nods of recognition ripple through the circle, strangers became witnesses to my courage, and I no longer felt alone. Each thank you for sharing felt like a stitch in the seam of my wounded self, sewing together a garment of empowerment I had long ago assumed was lost. I reclaimed my space by unfollowing Dad and Lisa on social media, blocking their updates so I could craft my own narrative without their drama intruding. I replaced their photos in my phone with snapshots of my morning walks in the park, of a book I finished in one sitting of a cappuccino. I made just the way I liked it, simple proofs that I existed beyond their expectations. When Dad called to check if I'd return for another dinner, I answered with honesty. I love you, but I can't come back until I know you believe I matter more than any relationship you forge. His pause on the line was filled with something like understanding, and I felt power in that silence. I began setting new routines, Sunday afternoons at the library, Friday evenings at art class, late-night calls, with my best friend instead of lies, that I was fine. I realized that boundaries are not walls to keep people out, but guardrails to keep myself safe. Slowly the knot of shame unwound, and in its place grew a steady confidence that spoke in clear, unwavering tones. I deserve respect. I deserve space. I deserve to heal. By choosing myself over the shame I had carried like a hidden burden, I discovered that my voice was not an echo of others' opinions, but a beacon guiding me toward a future where my worth is defined by my own truth. And that is the most powerful reclamation of all. In the end, I realized the greatest act of love wasn't returning to a house defined by heartbreak, but building a home inside myself, one where grief could breathe without judgment and joy could grow beyond guilt. The day I chose solitude over shame, I planted the first seed of my new life, watering it with honesty boundaries, and the unwavering knowledge that my worth didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Now, when I wake to the hush of morning light filtering through my window, I am not haunted by past betrayals, but buoyed by the promise of possibility. I honor Mom's memory by loving honestly, not by clinging to empty rituals of respect. And I honor Dad by trusting him to meet me where I stand, rather than dragging me back to old dynamics. If this journey from betrayal and exile to self-respect and renewal resonates with the part of you that's ever felt forced to choose between love and self-preservation, I invite you to share your story below. Subscribe for more tales of resilience. Hit the bell so you never miss an episode, and join a community committed to healing on our own terms. Because true freedom isn't found in forgiveness alone, but in choosing yourself. And that choice once made can transform grief into the soil from which your strongest self will grow.